my gosh, yes.
I haven't.
Easter egg is a real thing still.
I love that so much.
I just got a weird text.
Oh, I assumed you were getting angry Twitter stuff still. Like a hell of a nice guy, both from Gold.
The legendary Jeff Miller is with us once again to talk a little salary cap. It's our annual episode talking cap and digging deep this time. But before we get to all that stuff, Jeff, I got to know from you, a lot of our listeners have heard those 3 episodes that we just covered. Has anything really changed for you in your general philosophy towards salary cap leagues since we last had a chance to chat about this stuff?
I mean, not really. Like, things shift a little bit here. I guess I haven't
4-year windows in these cap leagues. But like you said, mostly that stuff that we talked about the first time we got together to chat about this stuff stays. Maybe any way of retaining a player. Is there anything that you stay steadfast to in that light?
It's just really
easy to retain. That gives you that flexibility, that key word that we've talked about so many times, Jeff, the flexibility to move that player to another team, trade him and get something back for essentially nothing. Because if typically in these leagues, if you don't re-sign the player, don't tag the player, he just the intent of moving that player maybe the day after I get the tag in, because if he's worth that amount of money to somebody out there, I want to get something back for that player. So let's talk about those factors. What goes into deciding whether to tag a player that might.
A big one is, and you have a note of it here.
Description thing that we all know about Jerick McKinnon, his changing teams and the big contract, the high hopes that San Francisco fans as well as dynasty owners everywhere have for McKinnon landing in San Francisco. That all factors in. But when you weigh that against the salary that would have to be paid for the player, and the fact that McKinnon is easily the best running back in free agency this year, if I were to let him go, it makes it for a really difficult decision. I haven't necessarily made that decision just yet. I've tried to play with my cap a little bit and make room for him, but I'm really considering tagging the player, like I talked about earlier, and then trying to move McKinnon, just because I know there are a lot of owners in my league that have made that list of potential free agents already and highlighted Jerick McKinnon's name as a guy that they're going to be chasing once that free agent auction starts. So those decisions are tough to make a lot of times. But like you said, creating that list and like I mentioned, knowing that your league's history helps make those decisions for sure. A few other things that factor in for me when trying to decide whether to tag a player is looking at those other teams that have players that could be tagged or re-signed and trying to make educated guesses on those players. A lot of times you might think, oh boy, there's a lot of really good names. So like you mentioned earlier, I let Keenan Allen go, but Julio Jones and AJ Green and Devontae Adams all should be coming up as well. If they all tag those players, all of a sudden Keenan Allen is the big name, the big fish that's out there, and he goes for way more than you expected. So making those guesses and trying to be as accurate as you can on those is an important thing to keep in mind as well. I also like to keep track of how much cap space is available in the entire league. I think we've talked about that on other episodes as well. If you know how much money there is to spend, you should be able to trickle down through that free agent list and factor in and place those figures next to those free agents and really get a good gauge of what you expect these players to go for. That should help you make decisions on these free agents as well. And then predicting those salaries as they go through. Like I just said, if you can predict those or at least come close, you should know by the end of making that list and putting those salaries next to the names, you should know if the player that you're considering making that franchise player is really worth the money.
Yeah, I got one more thing, but I want to tag something on the list, and I'll
try to think of all these factors in advance. You have a better chance of making a good decision, one that'll help your team. Let's move on to trading in the off trades. And for those of you that aren't quite sure what I'm talking about here, after those player retention decisions have been made, typically there's a little bit of time there where owners have a lot of cap space. They have room on their roster. They have holes to fill before that free agent auction, when that list has already been made. Agencies, so that gets released, and you just traded for Des Bryant, and that really messes with your plans. How the timing of that trade works into the NFL draft also factors in as well. So I think there are a lot of dynasty owners or salary cap owners that are timid when it comes to pre-free agent auction trades. I'm a little bit more aggressive than you are. Maybe I'm just a shade less lazy than you, I guess, Jeff. I'm checking out those rosters, and I'm more of the type that likes to deal away contract players, trying to send away that $4 player in a 150 cap that might free up just enough space that I can chase a little better wide receiver to fill that wide receiver 2 need that I have in that free agent auction. So I'm typically not looking to make big moves before that free agent auction. I'm usually looking to make those subtle moves to either create cap space, or
I think maybe I'm just better at giving out
and never really rebuilding. I really feel like on a contender, Jeff, that just like what I said before, making those subtle moves to create cap space, that's the all powerful factor that comes into play when you're in these cap leagues is you have to factor in that cap, and especially in tight cap leagues, $100 caps, $150 caps, some even less than that. A dollar can go a long ways. And if you have a guaranteed $1 or a guaranteed $2 that you could move away from to create space that is going to be vital in a day or a month or 6 months later, those are the types of moves you should be doing. On the rebuild, on the other hand, Jeff, you and I have talked about this a little in the past. There are times when you are rebuilding, and there are those savvy salary cap moves that you could make to bad contracts. We've talked about that in depth on past episodes. It's coming handy for those teams that are rebuilding and looking towards the future.
Ideally, you're doing that in season. In the summer, yeah, I'll take
or try to pet title. Savvy owners are the ones taking on that contract, asking for a future first to take it on, and capitalizing in the future. I think the best rebuilds in salary cap leagues are not the ones that only take a couple of months that you're talking about, Jeff. I think they're the ones that look ahead and try to plan those things out, do it a year in advance. It may sound like a negative comment or something that many dynasty owners don't like to talk about, but really planning to be bad for an entire year, earning a high draft pick in a salary cap league, and creating a whole bunch of space for a year out when there's going to be, especially if you can plan for a year when you expect a lot of free agent talent and maybe a lot of your fellow owners having a lot of their cap space being used. If you're able to time those things out right and it all comes together at the right moment, those are the best rebuilds, because you can go from one of the worst team or the worst team in the league to quickly become an ultimate contender in that league by making those decisions.
This is for sure what I did in Dead President.
Assets such as Dude.
There you are. I don't know. I instantly checked and my internet was working fine, but you just flat out froze and now you're in here twice.
It signed me out of my my Google. I had to re-sign back in. So I've got a pretty good gauge of where we're at. I killed my recording.
Oh, I did not. Would you like me to?
Yeah, I guess so. Are you going to be able to save it so you can send 2 recordings?
Yes. Hang on one second.
Okay.
Stop.
Mine was 26 minutes long, so
I'm at 27 and 10. Level of flexibility built in. And it's like whenever I help somebody like one-on-one, like the first question is, well, how much money should I leave in my budget? And the answer is, I don't know. It depends on your league. It depends on your goals. It depends on everything else. I like to leave maybe 5% of the salary cap. So in a $100 league, I like to leave $5 open. But I'm not afraid to eat into that, and I'm not afraid to add that based on how the auction goes. So I can't overstate it enough. You have to have a budget. You don't have to necessarily stick exactly to it. It can be dynamic. It can shift during drafts, but you have to have one. You have to know going in about what you want to spend on every player at every position. Yeah, and that's great advice, and I couldn't agree more. Actually, creating a budget is one of the funnest things to do when joining that salary cap league. It's one of my favorite parts of the league, and if it's yours, you should definitely be in salary cap leagues, or at least as many as Jeff and I. I also have a lot of fun trying to figure out those players' expected salaries. That's a really neat step of the whole process, trying to spend the entire amount of allotted money that's available in the cap throughout the league. And as you do that, you start realizing that a player that might be only a 2% player that you expect, there's too much money out there. Those players are going to suddenly be $3 player or 3% players. That's what regularly happens to me when I'm preparing for an auction. I seem to put those dollar amounts next to those players' names and then suddenly find out that there's still 10% of the money left at the end and immediately go to those high profile names to spend that extra 10%. So putting that prep in won't give you the auction by any means, but it might get you a slight edge and really help build that budget that you were talking about. You know, the real key here is don't assign values to these guys based on what you think they should go for, but on what you think they will go for, which is a pretty important distinction. This isn't you ranking players and you assigning them a dollar amount that you would pay. It's how much based on the league history, based on how much open cap space there is, based on team needs league-wide. How much do you think players are going to go for? If there's one top 15 running back in the auction, you best have that dollar amount super duper high because you can guarantee there's going to be some sort of a bidding war. This is a really important step in the whole process as well. I agree with you. It just gives you, even if your dollar amounts aren't exact, it still gives you a picture of the league and where this auction is headed. This isn't about being exactly right on how much LeSean McCoy is going to go for. It's about having a real good general idea on what's available and where the priority is going to be for the league at what position and in what tier within that position. And I think a good starting point for those trying to pinpoint expected salaries for players would be ADP and probably not DLF ADP, because that doesn't paint a very good picture of or it'll paint a picture, but not quite as good a picture of what to expect in a salary cap auction, especially auctions or leagues that don't allow more than 4 or 5 year contracts. I like to look at redraft ADP. The guys over at 4for4 do a really good job of that kind of stuff, those kind of rankings and ADP generally from any redraft source will help you put those dollar amounts next to players. So just a little tip that I use, I try to find that ADP and make sure those dollar amounts that I'm placing next to players and the tiers that I have in that free agent auction, those dollar amounts reflect what that ADP might suggest. So let's talk about
Go ahead.
I was going to say, especially for older players, especially for players that are pushing 30, it becomes, you get way more of a redraft mentality with those players than you do with younger guys. I agree with you entirely. I do the same thing.
Absolutely. So let's talk about targeting players, the types of players we're targeting. And I know it might fluctuate a little bit based on where your team is or expects to be in the rankings of your league, if you're a contender or if you're in the middle of the pack or even rebuilding. But generally, Jeff, what are you trying to do when you're targeting players? Once that free agent auction starts, what kind of players are you targeting, or what's your general philosophy towards getting those players on your team?
I could spend 3 hours talking about this alone. This is such a fascinating aspect of all of this. It's the best part of an auction, really. The first thing I want to say is my first nomination is it's never a player that I love, and it's never a player that I hate. It's usually somebody that I like and wouldn't mind owning, but not somebody that if I don't own them, I'll be heartbroken. And the reason for that is I want to throw that guy out there. I want to test the waters. If the auction starts slow, which very often they do, where people aren't really excited about getting bids out, they kind of want to see how things shake down, then I have an opportunity to get a bargain on a guy that I wouldn't mind owning. Conversely, if bidding is insane out of the gate, which very often it is, this is a guy that I've put out there. If I don't get him, if he goes to a different team because of the bidding is crazy, that's cool. I don't mind losing him. So my first nomination is almost always somebody that's going to garner pretty significant bidding. So maybe like a top 50 player, somebody that I like but don't love. That's always my first. I would love to hear if you have some sort of a strategy on your first nomination out of the game. Anyway.
Yeah, my strategy is different depending on the league, of course, and for me, it's all about that preparation. If you put the time in and made the list and place those dollar amounts next to players, you should have a really good feel for how that auction should go, how you expect it to go. And if there are 3 or 4 names, or maybe even only one name that really sticks out to you as a target, I've been known to be extremely aggressive with that player with my first nomination. That happened in a league that we're in together this off season. Jeff, I kind of targeted Allen Robinson. My biggest need on my roster was to try to get a wide receiver 1. I thought he was the top name on the board for me, and I thought he was the most likely to be a bargain among those names that were available, especially if he came out right away. So I was the first owner to nominate. I nominated him, and I put what I thought was a very aggressive bid. I ended up winning him at $35 in a $250 cap, and that ended up being one of the bargains of the auction, I felt. So maybe my philosophy has changed a little bit, but I really do feel it came down to that preparation, me pinpointing one player that really I thought would look good on my roster and fill a big need that I needed, and then trying to get him at a bargain, but not a crazy bargain. I wasn't trying to get him for free or anything. I was trying to play market value and not – and I obviously thought he was worth more than what market value was.
At the same time, the guy that you picked in this scenario wasn't an elite option at the position. I think there's definitely – that kind of falls in line, at least somewhat, with what I'm saying, where I'm not nominating. I don't think there's value in nominating. Keep going back to Odell Beckham. I don't think there's value in nominating him early in a draft, because his value is his value. The odds that he's going to sell for considerably more or considerably less than what market value is coming into the draft, or what your perception of market value is, are pretty slim. You're better off doing a guy like Allen Robinson, somebody that's kind of a few tiers below the elite, like a top 50 player, or in his case, like maybe a top 30 player. I think those are better early nominations than the best of the best. Another thing I like to do early with maybe my second or third pick is I like to test the waters on a cheap player, on a $1 player or a lower end player. You can very often sneak somebody through early. Maybe if you're in a league with defenses, you can sneak a defense through early. And I'm not talking about sneaking, I guess I haven't looked at defenses. I'm in so few leagues with them. I'm not talking about sneaking like an elite defensive option through for $1 that normally might sell for 2 or 3, because people are still going to bid on that. I'm talking about sneaking maybe like the 10th best defense, or if you have a list of like 15 $1 players you expect to get drafted, maybe like the third or fourth or fifth best $1 player. Those are the guys to sneak through early, because people aren't wanting to spend $2 on that guy early in a draft, whereas they might have extra cap space available at the end of the draft, which is when everybody is nominating $1 players. I like to sneak a couple of those guys through early if I can.
Yeah, and the best part about that is if you've identified a player as a $1 player, you nominate him and you get outbid, somebody overpaid according to what you think of the player. So I have no problem with that. In fact, I really like the strategy of nominating $1 players early and often in an auction, because truly, if you feel a player is worth $1, the only way you're going to get him on your roster is to nominate him. And so there's nothing wrong with doing so. I like to do it as well. I've, going back to what you said about the first nomination and what I said about being aggressive, there's been auctions this year where I have nominated players that I absolutely don't want and expect that player to go for way more than what he should. And that's worked out many times in the past as well. So there are a lot of philosophies when it comes to nominating. I don't think there's necessarily an incorrect one, but certainly most owners, whether it's just in a dynasty startup or in a free agent auction like we're talking about here with salary cap, we all find our niches and find the things that we think work, and those are a couple that work for us. So I want to talk to you a little bit about primary and secondary options. When you put that list together before the auction, before free agency started, you have the need for a quarterback one, or maybe a better example would be a wide receiver one on your roster. Obviously, when you see Keenan Allen's name and he's the top available free agent at the position, you're targeting that guy if you have the cap space and things like that. But perhaps there's a secondary option. Adam Thielen's also available, and maybe he'd fit in good for you as well. So you like both players, and obviously see Thielen as the second option, just as examples. But that second option comes up first. What's your general philosophy when it comes to that, Jeff? If that situation comes up, what are you doing?
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, baby. If you've got a chance to get a guy at market value and it's somebody that fits what you're trying to do, even if it's not your first choice, I think you just have to take it. And sometimes it's going to bite you. Sometimes the guy that you really wanted is going to go for less than you thought. But at least as often, that guy's going to go for more, because the way auctions work is every single time an option comes off the board, that makes what's left that much more sought after for the guys that didn't win your auction. And you proved that very well with your Allen Robinson thing and Top Dollar. You got a bargain for him when you got him. And what it did is it made the market that much tighter. It made the options that much fewer. And man, prices took off after that. That was a great call by you. And this is an example of how that can happen. And it goes in that direction far more than it goes in the opposite direction, especially when we're talking about maybe a guy like Adam Thielen versus Keenan Allen. It gets a little bit sketchier when we're talking about mid-tier players, but with those guys, it's still a real similar thing. I think you have to take what you can get. It's far less likely that in doing that, you're going to end up with a huge bargain later on in the draft. When we're talking about upper tier guys, bird in the hand, definitely worth two in the bush. I'm much more aggressive trying to get those guys early. Especially in the leagues that I'm in, there's certainly situations where value might get created later, but you have to kind of identify that beforehand and adjust on the fly, obviously, as well. As a rule, though, I'm going to be aggressive and I'll take that secondary option.
Yeah, and sometimes if you haven't nominated yet that day, or however your auction might work, if it's a live auction and it's one player at a time, obviously it's different. In a slow auction, though, you might have the opportunity, if you still have the ability to nominate, to put Keenan Allen on the block and put them up together so you can weigh them side by side. That creates other issues, of course, as well, but at least you have that option. I know that when I have the same philosophy as you. When I see that name that intrigues me, somebody that I want on my team, even if there's somebody out there that's better or that I'd much rather have, I'm going to be aggressive with the player and just try to fill the need. It is a horrible feeling to wait on a player, and then the guy you're targeting comes on the board, and you realize that everybody else with a need at wide receiver did the exact same thing, other than the guy who got Thielen, and suddenly you're in a bidding war that you really don't want to be in, and all of a sudden Thielen is the best bargain of the auction.
This is where your pre-draft prep comes in, and you have that list knowing how many people need high-end wide receivers, so you know what the need is versus what's available, and it will allow you to kind of make those moves. And this, not to jump ahead too far here, I know we're going to talk about this in a second. This is also an opportunity to be real aggressive with how you bid. Again, like you did with Allen Robinson, where you come out on a guy like Thielen and you make a very aggressive bid, and you maybe scare people off of him and they start turning their attention elsewhere. Early in the draft is a really good time to do that, because people look and say, oh, well, we have all these other options, so we don't need to try to compete with this really aggressive bid that you made. That's the time to do that. And a player like Thielen or a player like Allen Robinson are the players to do that on.
Yeah. Third and fourth tier players are great targets early in a nominating process. It's been a strategy of mine for a long time to chase the guy that's fourth or fifth on the list at a position early, because those other names are so intriguing. When you have Julio Jones and Devontae Adams and Keenan Allen all available and not on the auction board just yet, and you put that lower tier name, Thielen's an excellent example. There are so many fellow owners that look at the list and say, man, I'm going to have a lot of chances to get an even better player. I targeted 12%, and I know he's only at 10%, but I'd much rather have Keenan Allen at 12. If everybody else in the room is doing that, you ended up with a great bargain. Let's talk a little bit about future trade options. This is an intriguing situation that you might find yourself in a salary cap league. I found myself thinking about this a little bit more. We've talked about price enforcing and things like this. This is a form of it. I've seen owners relatively regularly lately, Jeff, buying a player or bidding on a player with the intent of selling that player, whether that be to a fellow owner that was bidding on him or anybody else. Is this a strategy that you've taken on at any point throughout your salary cap experience?
Don't like it for two reasons. First of all, it helps remove flexibility. We talk so much about flexibility in past podcasts. If you're drafting somebody that you wouldn't normally draft, or paying somebody something you wouldn't normally pay them or whatever, I mean, this is clearly a situation where you're stepping outside of your original plan to pick up somebody with the intent of trading them. You've now removed flexibility. You've put yourself in a position where you've dedicated cap space to a player that you now have to trade for your plan to work. You've forced yourself into something that you weren't planning on doing. And that just, I don't like being forced in a corner. I like having options. Now, if this is a player that you wouldn't mind having at that price and that position and everything, but you would prefer to trade him, that's a different story. But if we're talking strictly about signing somebody or winning somebody in a free agent auction to trade, I don't like being painted in that corner. The other problem I have with it is, why is it that you got a deal on this guy? You know, maybe the rest of the league doesn't like him as much as you do. So when you look at ADP and Dynasty, there are certain players that their ADP is very inflated. And then when you go and try to trade him, you have a hell of a time trading him. Well, the reason for that is if you have a draft, you only need one person in that whole league of 12 people to fall in love with a player to inflate their ADP. So if you're only talking about 1 in 12, well, what happens if that one guy's not in your league? What happens if you're winning somebody in an auction under the assumption that he's being undervalued, but you don't like the player, you're just getting him to trade? What happens if the one guy that likes him isn't in your league? Or even if that one guy isn't in your league, what happens if that player doesn't fit his plan? What happens if he doesn't have cap space, or if the trade isn't a good fit? Now all of a sudden you have somebody that you don't want, that doesn't fit your plan, that you can't get fair market value for, whatever the perception of fair market value is for that player. I don't like it. I don't like doing that in regular leagues. Guys that in 2 quarterback leagues in a regular dynasty and a startup draft 12 quarterbacks to try to corner the market, and then they're forced to trade them. Man, that's not a good strategy. It's not a winning strategy. I don't like it here any more than I like it there.
Yeah, I've never employed it either, and I can't really wrap my head around it. I've never found the big appeal to it. I see it happening in leagues, and like I said, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I just can't get on board with it. Couldn't agree more with what you're saying there. I think there's a big difference between strictly bidding on a player with the intent of trading him and perhaps being backed into a corner, the last guy left in a tier, and you may not be in love with the player, but you buy him and have that in your holster as a potential weapon that you can use. Maybe I can trade him. If not, at least I got a guy that fills the need that I need. I need that running back too. Alex Collins is on the board. He fits into my budget. I guess I'll just add him and hopefully it works out. Especially when it's a 1-year contract and you're not tied down with a player you don't love for the long term. I think that's okay. And having the option of trading that guy is always something you should be thinking about. You just shouldn't be relying on.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're signing a guy that you don't mind keeping, if you can't trade him, then whatever, that's fine. The idea of doing it strictly to trade is bad juju.
So let's get into these bidding strategies, and we've touched on a little bit, Jeff. I'm an aggressive bidder. I know you are too, mostly. When's the right time to be aggressive? When's the right time to sit back and wait, especially at the onset of these auctions?
Definitely aggressive early, especially on the types of players we're talking about. No real reason to be aggressive on elite guys. There's not a whole lot to be gained there. Those guys go for what they go for. Not necessarily a great reason to be aggressive, I think, on positions where the auction is real thin at that spot. Those guys are kind of going to go what they're going to go for anyway. I think being aggressive in situations like with Thielen, when you have a whole bunch of other players still to come, I think that's a great spot to be aggressive. I think it's great to be aggressive on players that are kind of lower end that you really like to be productive. It seems like I say this every year, and I know we have been of a similar mind. Pierre Garçon is a great example. This is a player to bid aggressively on, to come out aggressive. This is a guy that has a very short window to see lots of volume. He's not a guy that's going to win you your league, but he's a plug and play sort of an option. Be aggressive. If you think he's worth $7, open the bidding at $7. Or open the bidding at $8. Give an extra $1 to ensure you have him to help fill out the back end of your roster. Guys that fit that sort of a mold. I was going to say Larry Fitzgerald, but he's still too elite of an option. But think of like whatever half of Larry Fitzgerald is, or Pierre Garçon. Like that kind of a player is a great player to be aggressive on. Be aggressive with $2 players. Don't try to open a $2 player for $1 because there's only one bid left and it's $2. If you think he's worth $2, open him for $2. Another situation to be aggressive is if you're getting down towards the end of the auction on a player, bidding is slowing, and you really want that guy, instead of bumping it by $1, bump it by $4. Even if it means you're overpaying by $1, it will keep you from overpaying by $5 or $8 or $12 because it's a lot easier for somebody to keep being, oh, it's only another $1. It's only another $1. Make them think, oh my God, it's another $7.
I love that strategy, especially in live auctions. When you are sitting in a room or even at a TV screen or a computer screen and looking at the bids going by $1 and $1, it goes from 11 to 12 to 13, and then suddenly somebody puts 17. That gets people's attention, and suddenly you have to make a decision really quick. In a live draft or a live auction, that's especially that it works more often than not to be overly aggressive or what some would call overly aggressive. I like to call successful. So there are also times to sit back and wait. Jeff, I think you mentioned it really well there with those elite players. I can get on board with getting elite players in super flex leagues. I love to have Aaron Rodgers on my team. In any league, I love to have Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham Jr. or DeAndre Hopkins. I also love having Gurley, but there are times to sit back and allow other owners to do that. You and I both have talked ad nauseum about keeping flexibility. One way to keep that flexibility is to not pay elite prices for elite players because the only thing they can do is keep their value. They can't gain value typically.
I'm much more likely to trade for an elite player than I am to sign them in a free agent auction in salary cap leagues. And I know that might sound weird because you're giving up assets to get that player, but you don't have to give up as much usually in a salary cap league to get an elite player as you would in a regular league, because they have contract links. You can go get that elite player that has 1 year left on a team that's not using them. I would way rather wait until my team is ready and make that trade than try to mess with it in an auction.
Again, you have all the information in front of you. You know your team is ready to contend. Now's the time to pounce and go get Todd Gurley and try to make that run for a title. You know it for sure. And you know exactly where Todd Gurley is in his career when you're trying to get the Todd Gurley that can help you, not the injured Todd Gurley or the guy that's on the decline or whatever may be happening.
I did it in Dead Presidents earlier this week with I gave up Alshon Jeffrey in a first to get Julio Jones. I waited till after the auction. I had all the information. It's like, I want an elite guy. I want to make a run, and that's when I did it.
Yes. Perfect segue to our next topic, Jeff, post free agent auction trade. So the free agent auction is in the books. You weren't able to get a Julio Jones type player to fill that wide receiver 1 slot on your roster that you thought you needed. You needed an upgrade over Alshon Jeffrey. You pulled that off with one of these trades that came after our auction. Typically, these are more difficult to do because all the teams are a little bit against the cap. Most of the teams filled those needs that they really wanted. I know there are some opportunities to make these deals happen because there are so many teams that didn't fill those needs that they had or came close but think they need a little bit of an upgrade. Talk to me a little bit about your philosophy when it comes to these kind of trades and what made that Julio for Alshon trade work for you.
I had that trade, I wouldn't say in place before the draft, but I had discussions about that trade before the free auction draft. I knew that something like that might be an option. And that's certainly something that you can do, especially if you can identify a team that might not be going for it this year, regardless of how the free agent auction shakes down for them. I got a little bit lucky that this owner also has LaShawn McCoy, and he was on the fence about competing anyway, so it made it a little bit easier. But if you can identify situations before the draft that might work and have preliminary discussions, say, hey, is this something you might be interested in depending on how the free agent auction goes? You know that you have that option, potentially. Really for me, this is because the auction doesn't go how owners expect it to for all 12 owners. There's always a couple of guys that leave that auction disappointed. And if you can identify those guys, those are the ones you want to target if you're competing. Conversely, if you're the guy that the auction didn't go real well for, don't be afraid to be aggressive and start the rebuild before October. Like I talked about earlier, don't be afraid to start it right away and do what Adam did in this situation and make that trade. He picked up a first-round pick, saved $3 in salary this year, $3 in salary next year in a $100 cap league. It's a nice trade for him. It worked well for both of us.
Yeah, that's a big percentage, that 3%. And we've talked about that throughout the episode. Being savvy and getting out ahead of those things, you can give yourself the opportunity to have more cap space, still have a good player in Alshon Jeffrey. Those deals can work out for both sides for sure. And that's the brilliance of salary cap. Even more than strict dynasty, there are owners at every step of the building process in a salary cap league. There are so many levels to it because of the salary and the contract length and the player's value that can change the value of a trade and make things work for so many different owners. I think a big part of getting these deals done, and I guess it applies to the pre-auction trades as well, but not quite as much, is to be as creative as possible. There's always rules. And again, this goes back to knowing your rules and knowing the ins and outs of your league. Getting creative, covering parts of salaries or covering future cap space, trading cap space in a trade as well. That all makes it a little bit easier to get by those tougher parts of making trades once everybody is against the cap. Using your trade as an example, if both of you were right at the cap, full 100%, and there was a $3 difference in the players, simply covering the $3 difference or trading $3 of cap space can make those kinds of deals work. I've seen many of those trades fall apart because the cap numbers didn't work out. And most of the salary cap leagues all of the salary cap leagues that I play in allow for at least trading cap space. So keep your mind open to those types of things. We talked a little bit about trading players that you got in the free agent auction, and we talked about how we don't necessarily like to have that in mind. I do want to mention here that just because you just got a player and he's your new shiny toy, don't put him on the do not trade list. There are 11 other owners that didn't get the chance to add him to the roster, and a lot of times you can capitalize on those guys feeling like they missed out on that player. I've regularly traded players that I just got in an auction and felt like I came out winning in the deal. So keep your mind open to that as well. Any other notes on post free agent auction trades for you, Jeff?
Beautiful segue by saying notes. Our good friend Leo Pasiga would say, always make a note of who lost the auction for a player. If you write down your player's name, Allen Robinson, and then write Jeff next to it, because I was the guy that was bidding you up on Allen Robinson to the very end, that's the guy that you might want to trade Allen Robinson to. Those are the guys that you want to approach. It's an easy thing to do. I do it right in my Google Drive doc that I have for every single auction. Every single auction I win, I put the player on my roster, and in the column right next to it, I write the guy's name who I beat for that player. It doesn't always matter. It doesn't always work out. But if you're looking to make a trade, that's the first person to approach.
Yeah, great advice. Leo's the guy when it comes to that. I've taken on the same philosophy as well. I scribbled down the guy's name, and it's helped me a couple of times. Sometimes not till a year or two later, because you always go back through those notes. It's kind of like the diary of the league, and you see something that catches your eye, start a trade negotiation, and suddenly you got a deal. So good stuff for sure. So we covered a lot of the off-season transactions that salary cap owners will or already maybe have this year made. I think what we're talking about here should transcend to next year and beyond that as well. Retaining players. We talked about those pre and post free agent auction trades. And then, of course, that free agent auction, the preparation, and all the strategies that go into that. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the DLF Dynasty podcast. It's our fourth, as I mentioned earlier, in our series of salary cap coverage. Again, if you want to go back and check out previous episodes of salary cap coverage here on the pod, you can check out number 201. That was general salary cap strategy. Episode number 243 was salary cap startup strategy. And then episode number 261, that was rookie draft and in-season salary cap management. This is episode 316, and we covered off-season salary cap, decision-making. Jeff, I appreciate you coming on this episode of the pod. Tell us a little bit about where we can find out what you're up to lately.
I've done a bunch of stuff for DLF this summer, and I have a couple other things I think on the schedule. I should probably look at that. They're probably late by now. So you can find me all over on DLF. I am also now just starting to do some stuff for 4 for 4 this season. I'm going to be doing in-season player blurbs. I think I'm doing Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, if memory serves, during the season. And by the time this podcast hits the airwaves, if you go to 4 for 4 social media platforms, it'll be me that you're hearing from. I'm taking over 4 for 4 social media. So be sure to follow at 4 for 4 football on the Twitter machine, and then we'll get you the information on the other stuff. And if you really like my salary cap stylings, at Draft Consult Inc., you can hire me to help you with your salary cap league. I've actually already got a couple of clients this season that I've helped with leagues, and it's really fun, and I'm very generous with my time and my advice. So if you want some more one-on-one time, track me down there.
Oh, I have a feeling 4 for 4's social media profile is going to get a little bit more aggressive, Jeff.
No shower selfies on the 4 for 4. If you like shower selfies, waist up only, of course. Because I'm a kid. If you like shower selfies or just bathroom selfies in general, about 90% of my selfies occur in the bathroom. Then at FFJFM is where you want to be for that. Also lukewarm fantasy takes.
If you're not following Jeff already, you should be. Thanks for spending an hour with me, Jeff. To our listeners, thank you for spending an hour with us as well. We'll be back next week with another episode of the DLF Dynasty Podcast. We'll catch you then.
Sweet.
All right. That was fun.
I have to poop so bad. This is
on the backup.
Not going great. Oh no, I shut down the recording, so already saving and exporting, and
you still have access to that folder?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
I think last time I made a podcast appearance, I actually got article credit for it too. So
really?
Yeah, I think so. I believe
awesome.
I did. I mean, whatever. It doesn't much matter. I'm not doing it for the cash, obviously.
But still, that's good. You really should for this one. Like you put time into this.
I spent like 15 minutes the other day and like 15 minutes this morning and like maybe half hour, 45 minutes this afternoon. So I would say like an hour, hour and a half tops. It's not
but that's what I put into it.
Yeah, okay, fair.
I put an hour and a half into it and then an hour recording.
I do no prep for any pods